Harry Potter. And I hope you join me in registering your astonishment for our esteemed panelist, Roger Highfield, in conversation with Keshava Guha. The session is titled The Science of Harry Potter. Roger Highfield has authored The Science of Harry Potter, and Keshava Guha, the author of Accidental Magic. Looking at the overwhelming enthusiasm, I will leave it to the authors to open the house for questions to them. Can we all join together with a big, warm round of applause at the Bank of Baroda Better?
So we're gonna do this a little differently, in that we want this to be quite informal and just fun. So we're gonna open this up much earlier than usual. We've got an hour, so maybe in about half an hour we'll open up to the audience, and that way we can take many more of your questions, which is what we really would be looking forward to. So Roger and I have both written books that you use Harry Potter as a vehicle, you could say, to sort of follow our own interests. But the science of Harry Potter. So pretty early on in the book, you describe yourself as a muggle scientist in Harry's world. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what led you to write this book?
It is a mildly bonkers book, okay? I plead guilty to that. I was working on the Daily Telegraph. I wrote really hundreds, if not thousands, of stories about lots of different aspects of science. I'd done a previous mildly bonkers book called The Physics of Christmas, which did very, very well indeed. And I love the kind of cognitive dissonance where you're trying to take Santa Claus seriously. How does Santa deliver all those presents in one night? I could speculate about, did Santa do quantum teleportation? Did he have a warp drive sleigh? I took it very seriously indeed. I love the Harry Potter books, read them to my children, and I thought what a brilliant way, hook, to investigate all sorts of science, from genetic manipulation to Hermione's time turner to invisibility cloaks, you name it. And I had a lot of fun writing it.
So I want to come to some of those specifics in a bit. But so your book is about science and about magic, and you have and one of the nice things about your book is you actually take the time to define pretty much everything. And so let's start with magic. So there's a strong definition and a weak definition of magic, right? So what tell us about those two?
I think maybe the strong definition of magic is it kind of breaks natural laws. Now, of course, actually, if you do that in an atom smasher, you get really excited because you think you might be leading to new physics. But there's also a weak version of magic, which is, you just don't really understand it. It's a bit like Arthur C. Clarke's thing about advanced technology seeming like magic. And actually, by that definition, something like quantum mechanics, which I've struggled to explain in 300-word articles over the years, is incredibly magical.
Yeah. And even science. Now, in India, I think we've sometimes in the past we've had these distinctions between science and technology, or between pure or basic science and applied science. And you take a very wide view of what science is. So Roger is a science museum in London. But firstly, you range across the sciences, technology, but also you take insights from game theory, psychology, anthropology, history.
It's you get like everything in my book. It's such a great book. You've got to rush out and buy it.
And it's almost like with science, it's almost like anything that helps us understand and explain the world.
Yeah, I mean, I had, as I said, I'm passionate about science. I think, it's the scientific method is the most powerful way we have to understand the world. And I think the Potter books are extraordinary. And in fact, I love the way in Accidental Magic you meditate on whether, Proust is actually a more important work than J.K. Rowling, But I love all that, and I just decided that I'd take it very seriously in the first half of the book. Second half of the book, I'm looking a little bit more at why we believe in magic and so on. And actually that idea of basic science, technology, it's quite a murky relationship between science and technology. I remember years ago going to Bell Labs and finding that they were studying very arcane quantum mechanical effects inspired by problems they had with microchips and so on.
So let's talk about the first half of the book, where the first half of the book is where, and that's the half I think that, so it's the half where Roger takes the things that we see in Harry Potter's world, in the magical world, and shows us how they might actually be replicated or they might already exist in our world. And let's take a few of them. So let's start with time travel, because I think time travel and apparition is where you bring in quantum mechanics, and I've very rarely seen it explained so clearly. So would Hermione's time turner work in our world?
Time travel is a bit tricky, I have to say. But the interesting thing about it is that if you look in contemporary physics, you can't exclude the possibility of time travel. Stephen Hawking gamely tried to get rid of it with something he called the chronology protection conjecture. And everyone's worried, in fact, it's alluded to in the Harry Potter books by the grandfather effect or the grandmother effect, where you travel back in time, you kill your grandmother or your grandfather, therefore you could never have been born in the first place to travel back in time. So you end up with these causal paradoxes. So physicists have always been trying to get rid of time travel, but there are various solutions to theories in general relativity, and there are also ideas from quantum mechanics where you might time travel back to a kind of different parallel world, which means that it could be, you can't rule it out. So Hermione's time turner could really work.
But with the caveat, as you say in the book, that you can't go back in time to a time before the time machine itself was invented. And you have a wonderful line where you say, therefore the universe is safe for historians.
Exactly, exactly. And I have to say, I think there's something deeper going on here, which I feel that modern physics still doesn't quite get time. And actually, I've seen theories by one American academic that there are two dimensions of time, and then say Julian Barber, who's a philosopher, says there's no time at all. Time does not exist. So when you've got those fundamental differences in position, you can tell there's something very interesting in time and trying to understand it.
Now, somewhere where you're a little bit more optimistic about than time travel is teleportation. So you think, like, apparition, as it's known in Harry Potter, it seems a little closer to being theoretically possible.
We have had real quantum teleportation experiments. Anton Zeilinger in Austria has done some of the really early work where you can teleport the properties of one atom to another atom. And there are various quantum pioneers like Charles Bennett and so on who, I mean, one of the fun things of the book was actually ringing up something like 100 scientists and asking them, right, I've got to get apparition to work and flu powder. How can I make it work? And the slight tricky thing with quantum teleportation is you'd have to define the quantum state of the human body, which means you need a colossal amount of information. I think it was something like 1 to the power of 30 or 10 to the power of 32 or something like that. But you might be able to encode this information, I think, in a sort of Harry Potter-sized diamond. I think that's what one of them suggested. So maybe ground up, that is the flu powder, okay, that made it all. Are you following me, guys? Yeah, good. Okay, I'm going to be testing you on it afterwards.
Because you say that is it one atom can hold one bit of
exactly, exactly.
So on quantum mechanics for a second. So one of the things you say is, you know, the book. You know, Roger has this wonderfully epigrammatic style. His book is endlessly
I love
quotable.
This. I've never been called epigrammatic.
And you know, it's a kind of book where you're reading it and you want to. You should only read this book on your own, because if you have anybody else around, you'll say some version of "Did you know that?" every 2 minutes. You'll irritate everyone around you with all these facts. but on quantum mechanics, the line that Roger has, he says that it's great at giving factual or true answers, but it's pretty terrible at giving us a common sense picture of the world. So, which is why it's so difficult for those of us who aren't scientists to understand.
It really is a magical theory in the sense that truth lies in the mathematics. And as soon as you try and translate the mathematics into, a kind of visceral, everyday understanding of the world, it all kind of falls apart. Quantum mechanics has got all these counterintuitive ideas that a particle can be located at one point and yet be an infinite extent as a wave. The idea that two particles at the other ends of the universe can be entangled, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. So there's been huge rows about the sort of the meaning, in effect, of quantum mechanics that are still going on today.
So let's move to a different topic, the Hogwarts houses and the Sorting Hat.
Right.
So where you use game theory, actually. So the houses, so how would, and also genes. So how would the Sorting Hat work in real life?
Well, the Sorting Hat, actually, I think we're pretty close to Sorting Hat technology. There's quite a few brain scanning technologies out there. Magnetic resonance imaging is one. MEG spots magnetic activity across the brain really fast. It's actually quite surprising. If you look at very old PET scans of the brain, you get kind of technicolored poached egg style images of some centers warming up and others cooling down. If you look at functional MRI, you get a faster, more detailed picture of the brain. You look at MEG, which is done with squids, the most sensitive detectors we have on the planet, superconducting quantum interference devices, then you can really see crackles of activity all over the brain doing things. But we're now beginning to look at this information of the working brain and work out what you're looking at. So at the back of your head, or the rind at the back of the brain, the visual cortex, they can now read the activity in the visual cortex and begin to make a pretty good guess at what you're looking at. And of course, that's got quite a spooky sort of implication that if you fell asleep in one of these machines and started to dream, they could read your dreams, okay?
And the game theory, Slytherins and Gryffindors.
I wrote an earlier book with a guy called Martin Novak, who's a professor of mathematics and biology at Harvard. Martin's looked at evolutionary game theory and really why people cooperate. He's fascinated, we are the most cooperative species on the planet. You might not believe it, given all the strife and so on, but we are extraordinarily cooperative. And Martin has used evolutionary methods to model this and understand why a member of Gryffindor would cooperate with a Slytherin or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so to some of our favorite topics or favorite sports, so flying and Quidditch. So here you have both an account of flight, of broomstick flight, as well as something that I, as a Harry Potter lover, had never encountered, which is a possible origin sport for Quidditch. So why don't you tell us, let's talk about broomsticks first.
Broomsticks, well, of course, there are loads of broomstick theories, Okay, balloons, pretty slow, and we know from the movies that's not right. Rockets on the broomstick. Well, if you've got a long dangling robe, it's going to catch fire, isn't it? It's not very practical. There's actually more intriguing sources of levitation. If you talk to a Nobel Prize winner called Andre Geim, who actually got the Nobel Prize for his work on graphene, these two-dimensional materials, he used to have a sort of mad Friday night where he would just do crazy things. And one of the crazy things he did was to put a hamster into a very powerful magnet, and through a phenomenon called diamagnetism, he could levitate the hamster. And in fact, there is even, and I'm not joking, there is a paper written in a journal by Andre Geim and hamster Tisha. And you can Google it, it exists. It was a much-loved family pet and survived the experience. And so one theory is that maybe Hogwarts is bathed in some big magnetic field that by clever manipulations could actually levitate the broomstick flyers. Quite speculative.
But the same magnetic field makes it impossible to apparate?
Well, actually, now look, come on, don't start cross-fertilizing my mad ideas. It's already bonkers enough,
Yeah.
That's sort of bonkers
okay,
square.
So now what about Quidditch?
Quidditch, I was intrigued by the fact that there was an earlier ball game getting rubber balls into hoops, which actually the Spanish conquerors, when they came into Mesoamerican society, they came across the Mesoamerican ball game. If you think the stakes are high for World Cup soccer and so on, if you were a losing member of the team, you might lose your head or you might be dehearted. There were skull racks at the end of these Mesoamerican ball courts. When the Spanish came in, they'd never seen a rubber ball before, and they actually thought they were kind of magical. So I thought there was some intriguing link between the Mesoamerican ball game and Quidditch. I should say as well, I went to the world's first Harry Potter conference in 2003, where they tried to concoct a form of Quidditch, and I was on the winning side, which if you knew what a poor physical specimen I am, is almost miraculous. There we are. That is magical.
So it's like being a member of the Uruguay team that won the World Cup in 1930s. Yeah. So one of the nice things about Roger's book, and actually in a way in which it's a little different from the Harry Potter books themselves, is that we most of us here are Indian. We grew up reading Harry Potter in India. But the Harry Potter world is a very English world. I mean, it's in the tradition of the boarding school story. Most of us didn't go to boarding schools, and we certainly didn't go to English boarding schools. But your book is actually quite global. I mean, as the Mesoamerican sport is an example of this. Because I suppose science is not a national enterprise, it's a global enterprise. But I wanted to now move on to something else that I know many of us are interested in, which is magical creatures. And so let's start with creatures that we know of, but that are play a different function in the magical world. So owls, most prominently. I'm sure just as all of us who read Harry Potter fantasized about receiving our Hogwarts letter, we also fantasized about sending letters by owl to our friends. It's infinitely more romantic than any form of communication that we actually use. So Roger's book has good news and bad news. So the good news is that birds are capable of a lot. Here's another one of his great epigrams is experimental evidence suggests that birds are not in fact bird-brained. But while birds are not bird-brained, owls are not exactly the wise men of the kingdom of birds.
No, that's right. I mean, owls in ancient Greece were associated with wisdom. They were seen as spooky in later societies. And I thought that it would be fun to talk to owl experts, about could they carry mail. And of course, there are little elf owls that really couldn't manage a letter.
Like a big vision.
But then there are really big wingspan owls, eagle owls and so on. Then I wanted to know, could they travel a big distance? And I think short and long-eared owls in the UK are migratory, so they could carry a letter some distance. But then they've got to remember where to go. And then I had to look at a little bit of avian intelligence and memory. And there are beautiful studies on New Caledonian crows, which these are tool-making birds. The idea that humans, the tool maker, makes us a unique species is wrong. They tear up pandanus leaves and use these tools to kind of fish out grubs. So corvids are very smart birds indeed. And then I think, in terms of memory, scrub jays are very interesting. If they bury their food, and if they know they're being observed, they'll come back and rebury it. So they can sort of look into the future and think, I've got to protect my food. So there's quite a lot of avian intelligence there. And of course, grey parrots are famously intelligent. In terms of owl intelligence, it got more tricky. I found this chap, Eric Knudsen, in the States, who'd done these experiments where he'd made owls wear prism spectacles. It's a slightly mind-boggling idea, and it was to shift their field of view, so what they heard didn't quite marry with what they're looking at. So if there was a little chirping cricket over here, they'd see the cricket here, but the sound would be there. And then he'd measure how long it would take the owl to get used to this sort of dissonance, and then he could get a sense of owl memory. And I think it was not bad for young birds. So I think if we had a young, long-eared owl, we've got a fighting chance of owl male. So, are you following me on this? Okay.
One of my favorite sections in the book deals with the blast-ended scroot, And here, Roger, I think, outdoes himself because not only does he draw a connection to the animal world, he then goes, adds a little bit of very Anaraki World War II history, linking the blast-ended fruit, they're called the Bombardier Beetle?
That's right, Bombardier Beetle.
And the Nazi
the
V1.
doodlebugs.
The doodlebugs. So tell us about that.
Okay, blast-ended scroots. So you might think that a lot of creatures in Hogwarts are magical, but actually, if you look at real-world creatures, it's quite extraordinary, the specialisms that you can find out there in the natural world. And the Bombardier Beetle has these toxic, hot secretions where it's bringing chemicals together in its rear end, and then you get this pulsing effect, just like you could see in a World War II doodlebug, which leads to jets of hot, toxic material coming out. So the idea that a blast-ended scroot is that magical, I think actually there the Muggle world has definitely given Harry Potter a bit of a run for his money.
Yeah. So moving a little bit away from the science to the themes of fan culture and fandom, because you attended this fan summit, and so do you remember what it is in 2003?
2003, Nimbus 2003.
Nimbus 2003, exactly. Yeah. So
named after the Broomstick.
I mean, that name was waiting to be claimed. And actually, the first draft of my book, I cut this from the last section, had a long section set at a fan summit that was based on Nimbus 2003. But I just researched it. You were actually there. And one of the things that you found there was the subculture of slash fan fiction. So how many of you are familiar with slash fan fiction? Anyone? Yeah, there'll be a handful. So I grew up reading slash fan fiction, but Roger met the authors. So tell us about that.
Well, I was surprised. I must say, though, that I thought, though, your idea in Accidental Magic of focusing on Harry Potter fandom was a really rich, interesting area, because a lot of my experiences map onto your book. I didn't really know what to expect. I thought that there'd be lots of families. It was in Orlando, in Disneyland, or was it Disney World? I can't remember. Disney World, I think. Yeah. And when I got there, it was mostly 20-something women who clearly had never, most of them hadn't met each other in real life. They'd obviously communed online, and I'd never come across slash fiction. And slash fiction was basically, I think it's fair to say, well, in that case, it was mostly erotic fiction for young women, fantasizing about what if male characters fell in love. It came from, I think, a Star Trek sort of genre of fan fiction, where the most common one was the Spock / Kirk, where Jim, Kirk, and Spock secretly love each other. And, you know, when you see them on the Starship Enterprise and you detect a bit of tension, it's because they're in love, okay? And in a lot of the Potter / fiction, it was sort of Draco and Harry secretly love each other and want to tear each other's robes off and sort of... I'll leave the rest to your imagination.
I mean, one of the most popular, in Harry Potter fandom as opposed to the Harry Potter books, Draco was reimagined as a sex god, right? And so we actually used to talk about canon Draco versus fanon Draco, because so when you wrote fan fiction, you were supposed to be true to J.K. Rowling's depiction of a character, with the exception of with Draco, you were allowed to pretend that he was not the Draco, the rather uninspiring Draco that we, sort of pathetic version of a villain that we encounter in the books, and more of someone who is very sexy. And so these were... in Harry Potter fandom, they were what were called ships, right? So people who, it was like supporting a sports team. So if you shipped, ship comes from relationship. So if you shipped Harry and Draco, which means that you read or wrote Harry Draco fan fiction, and it was called the SS Guns and Handcuffs. That was the name of the Harry Draco community.
It's getting quite risque
gives
now,
you a
isn't
sense of what was going on. But so back on this theme, because this links to your book.
I think for the sake of the children, we better end this theme, actually.
Yeah. Well, so
I can see some very disturbed parents out there.
In my well, I did say our books both used Harry Potter as a vehicle, but So in my novel, there's a sort of a debate between two characters about how to be a Harry Potter fan, to put it very broadly. And the debate is about this. So they have a group that meets every once a week in person, right? And they just discuss Harry Potter fan fiction. And one of my characters, who's an Indian, wants to discuss the following question. And the question is, if you could possess any magical object, so like the Mirror of Erised or a Portkey or what have you, invisibility cloak. If you could possess any magical object, what would it be? And his friend, who's an American, says to him that we shouldn't talk about Harry Potter like this. We shouldn't pretend that we're in Harry Potter. Let's maintain the separation between Muggle and magic. So your book, of course, breaks down that separation with great glee, one might say. So did you get pushback from people who said, why are you explaining it? It's not meant to be explained.
You know, I was never trying to sort of prove that it was impossible. You know, the conceit behind this book and the Physics of Christmas was I took it quite seriously. You know, I mean, there are some things in the Potter books that actually aren't so difficult to explain. You know, we were talking earlier on about the Marauders map. You know, we've now got apps where you can see where your friends are. They're wandering down the street. So that's not quite so magical. Even saying spells, you know, if you spend half your life shouting at Alexa and Siri like I do, then that's kind of getting somewhere there. But I took the Potter books absolutely seriously. And some people said, oh, you're just trying to sort of prove, you're trying to take away the magic. But I actually think there's still a lot of magic left in science. I think when you answer big questions, you often open up other big questions. And actually, I don't think science has got all the answers about life. So I think there's still a big magical component.
So before I open up, I wanted to ask you, your book came out in 2002, and you know, science is always moving forward rapidly. So if you were to be able to revise it or update it, what would you add? And also, are there any areas in which you find that you were actually quite prophetic?
I would never really claim to be particularly prophetic, but I think there are lots of things that I'd love to update the book about. In fact, I've just been working on a book with an amazing developmental biologist called Magda Zernicka-Gertz, and you know, we're in a revolution in terms of stem cell science and being able to create stem cells you know, from skin cells and so on. We're almost in a kind of era of cellular alchemy, and I wish I could have had a bit of that in the book. Artificial intelligence. I'd love to know what the carbon footprint of Hogwarts is. There's a lot of energy flying around in Hogwarts. Are they contributing to global warming? I think we should be told. And maybe my biggest frustration is that within a couple of years of the book coming out, there were not one, not two, not three, but 4 mathematical schemes of invisibility, and then there became a huge interest in a class of materials called metamaterials, and we do now have some really plausible invisibility where these metamaterials in effect make light waves flow around an object, so you can't see the object itself, you just see what's behind it. So there's a much better invisibility scheme than I've got in the book.
And actually one area you talk a lot about is gene editing. Now, how many of you are familiar with something called CRISPR? Okay, so a good chunk, but a majority are not. So we should talk about that then, because it's something everybody should know about. Because gene editing has come a long way since 2002. So tell us about that.
I mean, huge advance. I mean, I did another book with Ian Wilmer, and a lot of the motivation behind creating Dolly the sheep was genetic modification. An old-fashioned genetic modification was you put a gene that you wanted to induce in an organism, in a virus, and you weren't quite sure where it's going to end up in the genetic code of your target organism, and to make, I think, one genetic modified sheep that made alpha antitrypsin, a sort of human drug in its milk. I think they created 1,000 embryos. They created vast numbers of sheep. It was very laborious. You wind forward to today with CRISPR, and as you're alluding to, this is a revolution, is making gene editing much easier, although there's still, I'd still be quite uneasy about using it on people because there is still concern about so-called off-target effects, but it is a sort of step change in our ability to manipulate genetic codes.
So we have close to half an hour for discussion with all of you. So I'm sure we got lots of questions. You can go first. Can we get him the mic?
Please make sure they're very easy, okay? That's the one. I've had to cover a lot of science.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a question which I'm Amrit and I'm a psychology student, so I think this question is relevant to my field of study. So in occlumency, as being described in the Harry Potter books, is a way to shut off the mind from whoever's controlling you. So could that have like a psychological basis to it, like in therapy, for example, where you're asked to, look at your thoughts and
Well, I think
control them. So is there some sort of a basis to that? Is what my question is.
in terms of what I find fascinating about, you don't realize how much your brain is editing your reality. When you move your eyes, the brain edits out the time that your eyes take to move from looking at here to here. There's a strange effect called chronostasis, where you look up to the second hand of a clock, and it seems to take a bit longer than a second to move, and that's because your brain has kind of edited you back in time to when your eyes started moving. Has anyone seen the gorilla video? Dan Simons' gorilla video? I'm probably going to ruin it now. There's not enough hands gone up, but this is a mind-boggling video where, gosh, should I tell them? I don't know, Dan Simons might be. Okay, someone's nodding madly. I love the gorilla video because basically it shows a gorilla bouncing. Sorry, it doesn't show. It shows some students bouncing a ball. And they say to you, count the number of times the ball bounces. So you get the whole audience going 1, 2, 3, 4. And then they'll say, did you notice anything odd? And actually, it's interesting. Usually 1 or 2 hands go up. And that's from the people who were not concentrating. They weren't counting. They didn't really care. Because what happens is a chap or a woman, I don't know, in a gorilla suit slowly walks to the middle of the video, bangs their chest, and slowly walks off again. No one notices it because their brain, their focus of attention is totally on the bouncing ball. And what usually happens is the audience goes, no, you've shown us a different video. This is not true. But you'd be amazed at the extent to which your brain is editing your reality right now. Don't trust the evidence of your own eyes. Things like memory is malleable. Elizabeth Loftus did these great experiments telling people about they went to Disneyland, they met Bugs Bunny. Oh, yeah, I remember that, blah, 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 blah. And then because she led them by talking about Bugs Bunny in Disneyland, they forgot that Bugs is a Warner character. If Bugs turned up in Disneyland, he'd be shot on sight, okay? So it's actually quite scary when you look at the implications for eyewitnesses. So anyway, all I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way is there's lots of fascinating research on that kind of subject.
So one of the interesting things that Roger's book and mine have in common is that his book was written in 2001 or 2002,
yeah.
And my book is set at the same time. And that was sort of peak Harry Potter in many ways. It was when Harry Potter first became a global phenomenon, but it was also in between the 4th and 5th books, 3 years, and it meant that there were many things that the Harry Potter. So some of you today were born after the 7th Harry Potter came out, I think. But for those of us who grew up with the books, after the 4th book, we had an incomplete picture of the magical world. So occlumency, for example, which you mentioned, it's only introduced in the 5th book, which comes out after the Science of Harry Potter. So actually, and I make a joke about this in my own book about where one of my characters says that wizards can't read minds. It's one of the abilities they've never been shown to have. Because after the 4th book, they hadn't been shown to have it. And then, of course, from the 5th book onwards, we know that they do. Okay, next question. Yeah. That's you, yeah.
Hi, I'm Shreyoshi. I have a question about how the pensieve worked, because it was basically taking out memories and storing them. And at the end of the day, memories are like neural signals, right? It's electrical signals. And the substance was described as something plasma-like in a way. And there's a case of Slughorn providing Harry with an edited memory. So how does the science of that work exactly?
Oh, gosh, we have had some interesting Nobel Prize. I mean, the general idea about memory is changing connections in the brain, and there's fascinating proposals now for looking at the so-called connectome of the mouse and looking at the connections in the brain of a mouse, and then putting a clone of that mouse through a maze and then looking at the differences to try to understand the basis of memory that way. And I think actually there are other techniques called optogenetics where you can sort of, in animals, start to understand how memories are encoded. So in terms of getting a liquid, maybe this is some clever way to encode information in DNA. You notice I'm madly busking and making it up because you're asking me about something I didn't explain in the book. But I think actually what's really interesting is I think we are on the cusp of really understanding memory now. People like Tim Bliss in the UK, there's lots of great pioneering work on this. So, gosh, I wish I'd written more about it. I think it's just about plausible.
But to her question about an edited memory, I mean, am I right when I say that over time, the more times we access a memory, in fact, the more flawed and inaccurate in a way it becomes?
Well, this is the work I was alluding to with Bugs Bunny. Elizabeth Loftus in the States did lovely work showing how you could manipulate and warp memories. So, you know, this idea that you could recall childhood experiences under the guidance of someone, I think is quite worrying because you don't know how much they're warping your memories by the line of questioning and the things they say to you and so on. Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why, for example, some historians are skeptical of oral history because how people remember an event is really affected by what's happened. Like how I remember my childhood now and how I'll remember it in 20 years will be affected by everything that happens over the next 20 years. Okay, next question. Right here in the front row. Actually,
It's a young person. I'm quite disturbed because the younger the audience member, normally the tougher the question they ask.
This is so cool. Who's your favorite Harry Potter character and why?
Oh.
It's easy.
Oh, it's got to be Harry Potter, hasn't it? Sorry to be so obvious, but no, I think it's just a brilliant creation by J.K. Rowling, and the fact that we're still utterly bewitched by, the Potterverse. And there's still spin-off films like Fantastic Beasts and so on. It's of huge importance, huge cultural importance. Forget about Proust and, dipping your Madeleines in lime tea. I mean, what's that all about? Actually, interesting memory effect there, I must say. But
so my favorite character is definitely Hermione. I'm always anyway partial to characters who give nerds a good name, and I think that she. On the high-low theme, there's a one of the characters in my book compares Hermione to a character in a novel called Middlemarch called Dorothea Brooke, which I think is a bit of a stretch, but only a little bit. Okay, next question. Let's take one right. Yeah, you at the back. Yeah. There's plenty of time, so don't worry. You'll get to ask your questions.
Hello. So my question is, when you were writing this book, Mr. Highfield, were you apprehensive as to how this would be perceived by the true blue Potter fans, or if Miss Rowling would have a critique on it when it was published?
I mean, I'm afraid I just saw it as a way. I mean, when you look at traditional popular science writing. It's a scientist who won a Nobel Prize, and they want to try to explain to the world what on earth they did. But I like to invert this idea and start with something that the world finds fun, Christmas, and then say, right, let's unpack all the science from that. And the same thing with Harry Potter. And I did get a bit of stick from the devotees, because I think they thought that I had some sinister agenda to take the magic away, but I really sincerely didn't. I loved the books, and it was a sort of a slightly bizarre, bonkers celebration of the books.
Okay, next. Also at the back, that side, I can see a hand, but if you got a question, maybe see if you stand. Yeah, exactly.
Hello. So my question is basically, what is your take on the science behind Horcruxes?
Oh, now that's actually one of the later books.
Yeah,
you
so
see.
that's
my official answer.
Yeah, so again, yeah, that's, well, I mean, because I'm trying to, where to start with that? I mean, I'm sure there are psychological,
There could be a psychological side to it. There could be, although I must admit I don't believe in this, but people talk about downloading their brains. You know, maybe Voldemort has downloaded his brain and actually been quite clever. He's looking for redundancy. You don't want to download your brain into one object, okay? So you're going to spread it around a bit. So maybe there's something there. Although I'm quite skeptical that a digital computer can capture the full richness of reality.
Yeah, let's take these three questions. We'll take all three.
They're laughing a lot. I'm quite worried now, actually.
Well, we all have the same question. Do you think that applying the Potter science to our Muggle world has the potential to benefit humanity?
Definitely. I think, I'm pleased to say that I think my book is the subject of a couple of college courses in America. So I think some enlightened teachers have already realized that the world would be a much better place if everyone rushed out and bought a copy of my 2002 Harry Potter book. Have I mentioned that book, by the way?
You know, on the subject of benefiting humanity, as someone who read a lot of fan fiction and then wrote a book about people who read a lot of fan fiction, there were also, fanfic writers came up with their own science ideas that would also benefit humanity. And I read, most of the fan fiction I read was by women, because women tended to write, certainly most good fan fiction. And something that came up in multiple fanfic novels that I read was a potion or a spell that prevents women from having to go through the menstrual cycle. And you think that a cure for period pain is again not something a male fanfic writer would have thought of.
You can do it with the birth control pill, I think. Actually,
yeah?
there is a scenario. I don't know if there's a obs and gynae person here, but I seem to remember that. Yes. Anyway, I think we're veering into dangerous territory again.
Okay.
Here.
Right here in front. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Could you both have a little bit of a chat about the economic implications of the Harry Potter universe on the Muggle world?
Oh my goodness me!
So
I've never thought about that.
Could you just say a little bit more about what you mean by economic implications?
So if you think about the way that Gringotts Bank works, there's a lot of hoarding going on of treasures. In Order of the Phoenix, there's that room where if you touch the money or you touch the things, they all multiply. You know, this sort of thing, how that affects the Muggle world. See what I'm saying?
That's a great question. I should have written the economics of Harry Potter. What was I thinking of? Do you know, I genuinely, my mind is slightly boggled by that question. I think that's quite hard. I suspect it would ruin global capitalism, Is that what J.K. Rowling secretly intended?
So, I think there are some things we know and we can speculate. So the first thing is that it's not clear if whether or not the Ministry of Magic enjoys the power of what we call fiat money. I mean, it's not clear. I mean, like the relationship between Gringotts, which is a private bank, and the Ministry of Magic is not clear. Can people just mint their own knuckles and galleons? Maybe. It's not clear if Gringotts charges interest. It does. The Muggle world, I mean, the Harry Potter world does seem to come from an earlier, less sophisticated, maybe less complex time in terms of finances, right? There's certainly large degrees of inequality, and maybe she's just trying to mimic. I guess she's just trying to mimic our world in that regard. But I think that. There's always a tension in Harry Potter that it started out as a children's book, but if you follow the logic of the world and you want to explain it fully, it would sort of cease to be a children's book. But you should write the economics of Harry Potter.
Great question.
Okay, now lots of questions suddenly. Yeah, you write that. Yeah.
My name is Ashita, and my question is that you said that broomsticks fly because of some sort of magnetic field around Hogwarts. But there
Highly
are...
speculative.
It's a theory. It's not a.
It's a theory.
Yeah.
But there are other objects that do. For example, Hagrid's motorcycle that he got from Sirius. So is there some sort of connection between the broomstick and the motorcycle, or is there another explanation?
There is a very speculative theory. There was a chap called Podkletnov who claimed that if you had a spinning superconductor, then things would weigh a little bit less when you put them above it. And he thought he'd glimpsed an anti-gravity effect. And sadly, we now know, I think it was flawed science. But if you're NASA, they did follow up these experiments, because obviously if it's a real thing and it works, it would revolutionize things. So there are speculative anti-gravity ideas. In fact, if you look at cosmological models of the universe, they talk about dark matter. It sounds like something out of Harry Potter, which is a source of gravity. We don't really understand that source of gravity. But they also talk about dark energy, and that's a weak anti-gravity force. So we know there is a real anti-gravity force out there. So that's another more speculative way that maybe the flying Ford Anglia, when they push that silver button on the console, you know, they're using dark energy to loft it into the heavens. Who knows?
Yeah, you right here in the front.
So my question is that what is the science behind a portkey?
A portkey? I think that's another variant on the quantum teleportation theme, actually. Actually, no, there is another theory, which is you could use wormholes. If you play with Einstein's equations, there are things called, I think, Einstein-Rosen Bridges, where you're warping one bit of space-time into a curve to connect with another bit of space-time. In fact, if you've seen the movie Interstellar, I don't know if anyone's seen that, Kip Thorne was behind that. And there's a fascinating story where I think Carl Sagan wrote a book called Contact. He wanted plausible interstellar travel, and Kip Thorne did a paper discussing how you could keep the maw of a wormhole open so you could travel in space and time. So there's a highly speculative, but based on real physics, idea there. So maybe we're using a wormhole.
Right here in front.
Maybe.
Yeah, you. Yeah.
So you know that basin in Dumbledore's office, and when Harry touched it, he saw Barty Crouch Jr. going to Azkaban. Do you think that's related to some kind of touch-sensitive virtual reality gear?
Oh, so this is the pensive.
Hey, you've answered the question. Yes.
Look at this. The earlier questioner asked the question, but Roger, she's outdone you with her answer.
No, you have. I wish you'd asked me that question before I'd finished the book, and I would have stolen your idea and put it in the book. So brilliant question.
Okay, wonderful question. That sets a high standard. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Did the way the movies represented things like affect the way you thought of how? Did the way the movie represent things affect your thinking about how it really happened?
It's certainly, they planted lots of, like the suspended candles in Hogwarts and so on. I think because J.K. Rowling was so involved with the movie series, it did give you another glimpse of what she was thinking of. So I think it did help me a lot. And actually, that was another thing that made me realize it was a great popular way to get to all these subjects. And I must say, the movie series, to keep that quality of, to have all those movies at such a, high standard, it's kind of miraculous, really, isn't it?
Yeah, right here.
One of the first things in Harry Potter that strikes us is the world transformations that happen. So basically, first it happens in platform 9 3/4, and then something like that happens again at Diagon Alley. So what is the science behind that?
Sorry, what was that again?
No, okay. Let me just say that he's asking about again the quantum teleportation.
Right,
So
right.
going through the platform 9 3/4.
Oh, yeah.
Diagonally. So you've sort of answered it already, but you can just repeat it.
There is another technology which is a bit more prosaic, but there's something called a fog screen, where you have a very laminar, that means a very smooth flow of air, and you know how in theatre productions you can have this sort of cosmetic smoke. So you have a sheet of smoke. It's a very, very smooth sheet of smoke, and you can project a brick wall on it. And there are fun images of people walking through fog screens. So that's a muggle answer to the problem.
Questions?
Got lots of desperate faces.
Let's take the two of you over there. Yeah. You and you in the same row, or the row behind you. Yeah, you. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, so how much does fantastical books and like magical realism inspire scientists to like create something and like research about that? Like, has something been inspired by Harry Potter and created after that once the books have come out?
Let's just take your question as well while we're
Hello, my name is Palash, and I wanted to know about Dementors. What about Dementors? How does they work? Are they a robot? Were they robot?
So first, do fantasy and science fiction writers inspire scientists?
I think there's a really interesting relationship between science fiction and real science. And I mean, if you look at in 19th century Russia, the cosmist movement were talking about leaving the Earth, and they were very inspired by Jules Verne. And actually, if you ask me why Russia, the Soviet Union, beat America into space, it's because there was this enormous fascination with space travel that led to space fairs in Moscow in the 20s and so on. So there has always been that link, or, I talked to NASA scientists who love Thunderbirds, that creaky old puppet show, which I loved when I had short trousers. So I'm sure there are links there. I'm pretty sure some newly identified species have had Potter-like names attached to them. And although I'm a science museum person, and I'm actually a bitter rival of my next door neighbors, the Natural History Museum, they're actually doing a Fantastic Beasts exhibition as well. So when I get back home, I'm going to dash over the road to talk to them about this.
And on Dementors, because this I know a little bit about. Many of you will also have read the His Dark Materials novels, and they have a very Dementor-like entity called the Spectres. And I think both J.K. Rowling and Philip Pullman have said, as far as I know, that these they're meant to represent what mental illness does in our society, and so actually so I don't know about robots in that sense.
There's an interesting take on Dementors, which is there's a very peculiar phenomenon, a strange form of consciousness called sleep paralysis. What you don't realize is when you dream, your brain paralyzes you. If you were dreaming of running down the road, you don't want to run down the road. And sometimes you can get in a strange state where you're conscious, but your brain is still paralyzing you. And there's a lot of people I've experienced sleep paralysis. It's a very strange feeling. You feel a lot of fear. And when you look there's a chap called Al Chain who's studied lots of sleep paralysis people, and his theory was people rationalized it in different ways. So in some cultures, they talked about ghost pressure. Other cultures, they talked about a witch lying on your chest, paralyzing you, always with this sense of some threat. A bit like the Dementors, alien abductions in the 70s. That might be another way to rationalize sleep paralysis. So I think maybe there's definitely something of the Dementors in the sleep paralysis experience.
We do have time for a couple more, but keep them quick. Anyone? Okay, so you right here. Yeah.
The Muggle and the magical world interact with one another, but the magical world seems to be aware, they're aware of the Muggle world and not vice versa. And I'm just wondering about the potential science around two universes interacting the way the Muggle and magical world do.
Yeah, I mean, there are brain world ideas about universes in different sort of brains, as it were, which are quite complicated to explain, and I'm not even going to try to talk about. That's actually a very intriguing idea. You've got me thinking.
Because J.K., within the context of Harry Potter, the answer that she gives, as you may well know, is that they used to interact side by side until this international compact on wizarding secrecy. And maybe because I'm from a social science background, I saw that situation as being analogous to a persecuted religious minority, like the Christians in the early Roman Empire, right? So it's more that you have to hide out of necessity. And it's actually, they don't hide entirely, right? They just hide the fact that they're magical. So you might see them, let's think of how Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone starts, right? Because Voldemort has just been defeated. And so all these wizards and witches come out into the open. So they can be seen, and they wear it in their cloaks. It's just that normally they choose to just sort of seclude themselves, maybe not even using much magic. Do we have, maybe one or two more quick ones? Okay, you all right over there? Yeah, exactly.
Hi. Well, one of the questions I had was, in Harry Potter, there is a very interesting thing that happens where they form this secret society called the Order of the Phoenix. And in terms of science and maybe even social science, just the forming of these secret societies to overthrow governments and rebellions and revolutions, what do you think Harry Potter has to say to the sort of revolutionary spirit that is happening amongst the youth today as well?
I think that's
I'll take that one.
That's a good question.
Well, I think what it says is frankly very simple. And what it says is the fact the government says it's true does not make it true. The fact that the government says it's right does not make it right. Right? So it's as simple as that. Because what's the situation is that initially Cornelius Fudge is in denial. Subsequently, the ministry is actually infiltrated and taken over, right, by the Death Eaters. So, yes, the government does not have a monopoly on truth, and sometimes I don't think it's a call for armed resistance against the government, but it's definitely the idea that in those situations you do have to organize with other people who have a different view of the right and the truth. I think we have time for one final question.
There is an evolutionary game theory angle. I think Martin Novak has modeled evolution of societies where you get defectors, revolutionaries coming up, taking over, and then they're deposed and so on. So there is a way.
Okay, so actually the two children right here in the same row, if you have very quick questions, we can take them both, but very quick, please.
Quick and easy, please.
Yeah.
How does the book and the quill, which submits students to Hogwarts, know when a student has shown magical power?
Oh, okay. And you? There was one more? Yeah, very quickly.
I'm just going to ask, what are your views on how house elves have to obey and they get special powers when they
okay.
have to?
Gosh, two very hard ones indeed. I think the brain scanning technology I talked about, there must be a paper out there about fMRI finding the magical center of the brain. If they can detect whether you're destined for Slytherin or Gryffindor or whatever, surely they can do that. Gosh, I'm a bit stumped on the second one.
Well, he does discuss house elves in the book, but on the quill, you mean the quill and how you find out? Well, even Roger doesn't know everything. So look, as I said at the start, we both used Harry Potter as a vehicle to write about other things, and Roger's book. When I was reading it, I thought this is the science teacher I wish I'd had. Maybe I would have been more interested in science. But I would also say that while we've been chatting about Harry Potter for an hour, both our books. You don't have to have read a word of Harry Potter, I think, to read either your book or mine. I mean, people who love Harry Potter will read it one way, or bring some things to it, and people who don't love Harry Potter will bring other things to it, and they'll take other things out as well. Which probably is, just a testament to the imaginative potential of Harry Potter. I mean, the amount of different interpretations and diversions it can sustain.
Yeah, and I think we're both here really to pay tribute to
Yeah.
J.K. Rowling and her amazing feat of imagination, which is really captured.
Now I know
the
that many
imagination
of you couldn't get your questions answered, but we're both signing books, so you can certainly ask Roger your.
You can ask us more fiendish questions then.
Great. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
We'd like to honor our fellow wizards with festival scarves. Both the authors will be available for book signings. That's to the right of this, left of this venue at the author signing tent. This program was presented to you by Denik Bhaskar. Ladies and gentlemen, you can also avail the Jaipur music stage. We've got the famous Kashmiri folk singer Abha Hanjura performing this evening. The program starts at 6:30 at Clark's Amer.